everybody, and good afternoon. My name is Karl, and it's described by Norville. I live in upstate New York, and we've since added to our animals 2 parakeets this week. But I've been very interested in Excel for a number of years, and really have focused on it, and I'm thoroughly look forward to actually sharing some of that information with you today. Let's look at what the agenda is going to be. First of all, we're going to go over why we started this process. We've done several of these Excel seminars, tips, and tricks over the last several years. And for one of our quality conferences, we actually did this, how to handle large amounts of data. But we're going to go into the why on that and a little bit of the history of Excel. Next, we're going to look at the best new tools in 25 years. According to one of the experts in the field, they call him Mr. Excel. His name is Bill Jelen. His website has about 1 million pages because there's a lot of posts, a lot of information in that website. It's one of the great resources out there. But before I go through the newest tools, I'm going to talk about the previous best tool, pivot tables. Then, building on pivot tables, the best new tools. Power Query, Get In Transform is the new name for Power Query. Power Query was an add-in free from Microsoft as of Excel 2010, and now has been renamed as Get In Transform as it's actually part of the data ribbon. And then we're going to look at something called the data object model. And the way to think about both of these two is you retrieve the data through Get In Transform and then use your data model to relate it so you can do a much more effective analysis. And then I'm going to just briefly go over Power Pivot, which I call pivot tables on steroids, and just a single slide on BI desktop. And what my strategy here is to plant a seed. I'm going to show you a technique of teaching pivot tables. Take about maybe 7 minutes, and because we really build on that throughout the lecture. And then we're going to expose you to the best new tools, Power Query and Data Object. And then I'm just going to mention the last two. And it's important to say this up front. There's a lot of information I'm providing. And what the goal is to try to give you what you don't know and expose it to you, and then show you the resources of how you will can learn more about it. Many of those resources are free. In fact, if you now look at the bottom of the slide, there's one person who has a website, Excel is Fun. He has 3,000 different Excel videos out there, 50 playlists from everything from how to use Excel as a beginner to actually classes on statistical analysis. Once again, that's free. It's incredible about this gentleman, Mike Jervin. He's got an incredible amount of enthusiasm and voice inflection, and really makes his lectures easily. Then the second person I mentioned was Bill Jelen, who's called Mr. Excel, and he has about 2,000 videos out there. So my goal is not to try to cram everything into today, but at least expose you to this. And based on that exposure, you now have information that you can go to. You will see on several of the slides where it'll have a hyperlink that will actually take you to a free YouTube video where you can learn more. Now, once again, watch to see what you can apply. Many solutions are common recipes. Don't be intimidated by the amount of information that's there. So now we're going to go into the why. Why did we start this process in the ASQ Central Mohawk Valley chapter? What the goal was to give a skills expertise edge to quality professionals by using an underutilized tool on their desktop. And I'm not going to read this, but it talks about skills projected to grow includes the basic analytical tools such as pivot tables in Excel. And this is from a book called the IBM The Quant Crunch. And you can see at the top of it is how data science skills are disrupting the job market. And what the idea is not for the quality professionals to go into this field, but to give them an extra tool as part of their tool belt to increase their expertise at work. And I mentioned it's all going to be using Excel. And I talk about Excel because basically you have everybody has Excel on their computer. It's free. And the main thing is people are not using its full capability. And by using its full capability, you're able to get things that used to take an hour and do it in minutes. Things that used to take a minute, do it in seconds. In the past, we used to do a series of tips and tricks. In fact, I'll even cover a couple tips and tricks in this lecture because I just can't help myself. But the main thing is to show the new powerful techniques to handle data. And I actually have a definition for large data. Excel limitations history of this large data. In Excel 95, 16,000 rows, 256 columns. 2003, they almost quadrupled that with 56,000 rows, but the same amount of columns. 2007 allowed 1 million rows, 16,000 columns. And I think if the first column is A, second column is B, the 27th column is AA. I think the latest one is XBJ that you can actually go to, which would be 16,000 columns to the right. That does seem like to be embarrassment of riches. But consider yourself at McDonald's, where they try to capture every single transaction. Some of those transactions are for me. And what you will find is as they capture them, over time, you're going to very easily go past the 1 million rows. In fact, if you talk about multiple stores, because you would want to take a look at store versus store comparison, you'll actually hit that limit much, much earlier. And so in Excel 2016, it took something that was previously a free add-in by Microsoft and put it under the data menu. And you can see here we have get and transform at the bottom. And we also have queries and connections, which are also part of this data menu. And it's called get and transform. There's also, which we talk about later on, is Power Pivot. This is still a free add-on. It has not been integrated yet, but can process 100 million rows. The file size could be 2 gigabytes, but you cannot exceed 4 gigabytes of memory. And one of the things about this is you probably have to special configure your Excel application. Instead of using 32-bit, which is common, there is, when you install it, you can make it 64-bit. And that will help you with the largest size spreadsheets. So let's talk about the previous most powerful tool in Excel. My approach is that I'll take something that you know, which is charting, and then show you how it's similar to the pivot table generation. Now, at one point, instead of calling it pivot tables, they wanted to call it a summary table. And that's what I really like about this technique, is it summarizes information very, very well. And what you have on the left-hand side over here is your raw data. Every single day, it'll show week ending, which corresponds to what the date was, criteria such as region, east, west, north, and south, and then a value. But if I wanted to reorganize it and to get it into a better format, what I could do is put it into a pivot table. So now I'm going next to go into Excel. Okay, so here's the data. I just highlighted all the data. I do insert pivot table. That range looks appropriate. If you look at the marching ants, it surrounds all the data. There should be Jeopardy music right now. In fact, I'm going to do that again because to make it easier for presentation, what I'm going to do is put everything on the same spreadsheet. Now, this is where people get intimidated. This is what I will address through my lecture. I have the different columns here: date, region, value, and week ending. And now I want to get a table similar to what I saw before with week ending on, in the same column on different rows. I want to compare the regions, so I put that in the columns feature. And then I put the value. And once again, lo and behold, I have a pivot table. It's that quick. And one of the advantages of this is the fact that I've heard numbers where there's 500 million people who use Microsoft Excel. About 75 million of them, about 15%, use pivot tables. I've heard that number as low as 6%. And what's your advantage here is the fact that you can understand pivot tables, and that will really put you in the top 84 or 96, 94% of people who are using Excel. Now, why is this called a pivot table instead of a summary table? Because it did summarize it pretty well. Well, if I go here, I put region, I now completely have changed, pivoted the information that was there already. I could even put it overlapping to each other. And that's why it's called a pivot table. Although it has been said that the words pivot table has scared some people away from using this as a tool. As you can see, it's not that bad. So because I can't help myself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you our first trick. Our first trick is I hit Alt F1 for instant chart on the same page. So I put my cursor, I'll put it on the 42, and I'm going to hit Alt 1. Oops. It might have been actually, okay, Control 1. Oops. I'm sorry, it's F1. And lo and behold, I have a chart. For you who get the correct keyboard shortcut, see how instantaneous it could be. And once again, I sure filed my notes up here, which says Alt F1. If I wanted this to be on a different page, I would just hit F11. Second tip. Typically, what I want to do is put a chart title on this. I'll hit a chart title, hit chart title there. Don't go to this box, but I'm going up to the formula bar. And I'll say equals, where I have a preset name, quality data of April 18th. And this is a nice trick that this is a dynamic title. So if I change this from 5/1 to 2018, it now reflects May. So if you have a series of charts, you just have to change one cell, and all your titles will be dynamically changed. So that's it for Excel at this point. And now we'll just go back to PowerPoint. So what you saw that I did was I highlighted the range to get the pivot table. Then I went to a pivot table, which is under the Insert menu. And that's where I came up with the screen. But that screen that you initially come up with is intimidating. So let's compare it to a chart that we just made. Let's overlearn what we know about this chart. On the horizontal axis here, which is the x-axis, you have 4/6 for the 4/27, typically a time range. Over here, you have the legend with the colors actually distinguishing and comparing between the East region, North, south, and west. And then the values are all summed up under the vertical axis here, or the y-axis. And so if you understand that, think of it as a chart. Let's see how that would compare to a pivot table. Well, what we see is in the legend, which is the region, each of the entries in a different column going across each other allows you to compare yourself to them. Each of the data entries are in a single column, but with 4 different rows. And once again, the values are going to be for this axis here, y. So 77 looks like it's the highest number, and you can see 77 is there. So let's take that one step further and artificially place that onto your pivot table. What you have here is you have your different regions, and I've circled that because you're putting those under column labels because they're all in different columns. Over here, you have your dates, 4/6 to 4/27, your x-axis, which is under the rows. And finally, the values. So taking away the artificiality, but what I would actually put into this is I take each one of these what they call fields, and I would drag week ending down to here. I would drag category down to here. I would drag value down to sum value or values. And so if you keep in mind, the most intimidating part of pivot tables is more understandable because you see this and compare it to what you do all the time, which is charts. And then you have the final result. Now below on the final result, I also have the YouTube videos. The first one, I think, actually goes to a web page, but it talks about how many keystrokes you do on a pivot table versus a formula. And it's like 81 to 16. It's pretty significant. Learn pivot tables in 6 minutes. Another gentleman has done this. And Excel is fun. Pivot tables. He does this in about 10 minutes and 19 seconds. The formulas versus pivot tables, that's about 10 minutes. The other one's self-explanatory, 6 minutes and 23 seconds. But your learning of pivot tables does not have to end there. In Excel 2016, when you go to a new spreadsheet, you can see here there's something called Make Your First Pivot Table. And I've magnified it. And this is a spreadsheet that shows you how to do your next pivot table. And I'm going to represent the first, the start slide and the learn more slide next. Here's your first slide. Make your first pivot table. It's under start. Your make a pivot table from scratch is under learn more, or actually 20. And so you have 20 steps of how you would actually go ahead and make your first pivot table. Let me stop here and cover 2 key points that are built on pivot tables. The first point is, what is the best format for data? The best format for data is what we had in the first place. We have a date, the region, the week ending, going to a single value. And all the values are in a single column. All the regions are in a single column. All the dates are in a single column. An outstanding article by myoutlinetraining.com, Excel tabular data format. And it's by Minda Tracy, who's out of Australia. I'm taking some courses from her. And what is good is she talks about all the different ways you can have your data. This is the best format. Let's show a bad format. See this all the time. And what's the difficulty about this? It's the same information, but that the dates are in each individual column. That unlike the previous pivot table, it's very hard to summarize this data. And then if you're entering the data and you want to find this spot right here, you want to make sure that's north of 421. And the difficulty is You want to make sure that you didn't put it in 422 or you didn't put it under East. It becomes an eye chart because you have to ensure it's on the right row and the right column. As opposed to going back to the ideal format, everything is its own row, no eye chart. Much easier to add in data. And what's remarkable, it makes it, even though it's easy to add in data, makes it much easier to analyze the data as well. I can summarize these dates very, very well, even without the week ending column there as well. So let's go to the second point. Summarizing data. In fact, there's a point there from Thomas Henderson. This will be covered in a few minutes when we talk about the data model, where you capture information and you put it together into a pivot table. Summarizing information. This addresses the title of this talk. How do you deal with large amounts of data? This is only, I think, 26 lines, not that big. But what if it was 2 million lines, 10 million lines, 50 million lines? What you would find is that Excel could not import that. It would actually error out. But when you summarize it through a pivot table, you have 4 summary lines and then 3 lines of overhead as well. So you can actually have the information stored somewhere else, bring it into Excel or even into Power Pivot, which we'll talk about a moment at the end of the lecture, and use that summary as what you actually have in your Excel worksheet. So the summary will definitely probably be less than 1 million rows, and that's how you can deal with one way you can deal with large amounts of data that are that can be summarized through a pivot table. Okay, get and transform. This is where we're going to start talking about new tools. Get and transform has now been integrated, as you can see above, under the data menu. And you can see get data. You can get from text, web, existing connections. And in the past, there was an add-in called Power Query, which you would use if you had Excel 2010, 2013. And there's add-ins. There's add-ins on your worksheets as well. When you file on your Excel workbooks, at the very bottom, there's a section for add-ins. The main thing to think about Power Query and Get and Transform, it's recipes. It's very similar to macros, but you do several actions. And with the thought, you do it once, use it forever. Okay? One of the key points is not usable in Excel 2007. You have to have at least Excel 2010. And you're going to be living a lot by queries and connections, which allows you to refresh data, and we'll show that in a few minutes. Well, the next point that I'm going to be showing in a slide in a few seconds is I got a fancy name for something I used to do all the time. I still do. Is I get data from one source, I clean it up, and then I put it somewhere else. Well, it's called ETL, extract, transform, load. And so with the transform, you're manipulating it, you're cleaning it up to be useful, you're taking it from different sources, and the final thing is you're loading it to something else. And what are some of the areas where you can get information from? You can get from CSV files or text files, Excel files, SharePoint, including list, Microsoft Access. If you have a really big database, you can use the Get and Transform to take the information from a huge database such as Microsoft Access and bring it down so you can summarize it onto an Excel sheet. SAP and the web. Well, here's one of the ones that I think is kind of interesting. You can now download Facebook entries for your company into Excel. And you can see here is where you have to show the connection and everything and learn more. But why would you do that? Consider comments that are made under your company. Some might be good comments. Some might be negative comments. By bringing all the comments into Excel, you can make this into a metric that you track over time, month by month. It could be as simple as a percentage of positive comments, percentage of negative comments. Or you can even try to add numbers to it, saying, if someone says the word awful in their comment, that comment gets a 1. If they say outstanding, that gets a 5. And so you can actually track this as a metric month after month with quantitative data. Okay, this covers basically, as I said, comments, but you can also do friends, games, likes, how many people like your website perhaps, permissions, and any post. So now that we finish the extract portion of Get and Transform, let's look at a common problem. In fact, it's a problem we just discussed. We want to clean up this data. We just showed basically, I guess this is called the bowling chart, where you put all the information, dates going across, and then all the features going down. And then, for example, say, okay, it's not flat, for 4-3, there's a 1. Or some people will actually have a pivot table, which is great, except what they'll do is they'll copy and paste the pivot table so you don't have the ability to pivot it anymore. You just dealt with this information. So how do we go from this type of information to the ideal side? Okay, here I have the process where this is old data, but for example, there's a defect, there's some dates, and let's see, sort of tough to say which numbers are dominating. You have to say, okay, this 7 goes to loss, so it's tied with that. Versus you reorganize it, you could do max value over here. You could actually show by date. And it'll be easier if once I put this into Excel in this format, say, well, what is our information for the month of October? Here, I almost have to do a separate calculation with a formula. And this is called unpivoting. Not sure how many people have heard of unpivoting before, but the main thing about this is you can look at Excel unpivoting. I have a link to a YouTube right there, and right now I'm going to show you what's involved with unpivoting. Right after this fancy graphic, which I says, here's our data, here's what I turned it into using the word unpivot. Okay, what I have here is that data as I originally presented to me, with basically all the defects going down and all the dates going across. And what I have here is a query which has defects. This query is a recipe. Let's look at what that recipe contains. And I've just highlighted, magnified what was here, down here. There's basically about 6 or 7 different rows here as a recipe. What I'd like about this, and take this to consider, 7 lines. It's not as intimidating. It's easy to learn. So this is what the data looks like at this step, which is change type. If I go to the follow-on step, which is unpivot other columns, I instantly go down and brings it into this unpivoted form. And this unpivot columns is under the transform menu, but it's called unpivot columns. So that completes unpivoting. The next thing is show you a different feature of Get and Transform, or previously Power Query. One of the things, Utica Proud, we have one of the best 15 races in the country. It's the largest. It's just not a race for a morning. What it is actually, though, is a weekend where whole weekends are in Utica. Talk about this event. Happens in July, and so everybody else they see runners. You got a runner there, runner here, more runners down there, a bunch of people behind them, a bunch of people in front of them, perhaps. And what I see is data. I see, do we have male or female runners? How many of each? What's the age groups of each of the people? What's the geography? Are they from the Utica, New York area? Are they from across the country? The winners tend to be from Kenya and some of the other nations near Kenya. And so what will satisfy me is if I can go back and try to turn this picture into data. Okay, now this is the official race results from 2013 to 2017. As I mentioned, the race is in July, so there's no 2018 data at this point. And once again, here's the YouTube, which talks about consolidating CSVs or text files. And what I want to do is I want to be able to compare what's the winning times or the top 5 times if I want to average those out from the race in 2013 versus 2017. And so I can't do this because each of these is in its individual file. You'll also see this on automatic data collection equipment, where every day a new file is generated as a text file of something that was actually inspected as of that day. And you'll see once again as a text file. And what the trick is, I want to put these together. So let's do that. I use the get and transform. And here I have basically, for brevity, I've just put down the first 2 winners of the race, the first place and the second place, for each of those years. And so now I can actually compare year to year. I can look at the average of 2013, the average finisher, versus the average finisher in 2017. I can actually take a look at whether or not is there a difference between people who train and people who don't train, which gives us not a normal distribution, but will give us a bimodal distribution, and compare that from year to year. So how did I get here? Well, what I have is, I'm going to make this a little more complicated. I call this problem 2A. I liked my results so much from 2013 to 2017, I actually put in more years. But here's the trick. This is in one part of a file hierarchy. These are a different part of the file hierarchy. And what you want to do is say, does that overly complicated, or do I have to take everything that's in the one file and bring that back in for analysis? So here's the information I have. You know, there's about 57,989 rows right now between when you combine all those years. Now, and we'll see how well it works on WebEx. Let's see about how much time would it take in this new complicated dual hierarchy format to get the information. So I'll go to data. To what is now my new best friend is refresh all. And I see the hourglass. Now what you'll look down here is the fact it'll say processing data, reading data. It goes over to the other side with a background query. And okay, that didn't work. But you can see basically at this point, let's see. Nope. Basically at this point is everything, how quickly it was able to look at all those rows. And to give away the secret is what I find when I add the extra data, I now have all the extra names on here from 2009 to 2012. And the problem that didn't work was I would try it. I'd change the slide so that I could refresh it. But unfortunately, I didn't put the new data in this format above. So you can see I now have 2009. I have to reorder these, and that's some additional steps. But I can very quickly, within seconds, append and consolidate data. One file appended to another, overall. I have one task I'm doing that appends about every entry since the beginning of the year. And so that shows you there really isn't a limit on your appends or consolidates. So going to the third point, consolidating data. How data is kept is often a constraint for summarizing. For example, very often you'll see this with accounting. Accounting will have all the data put into one tab, one worksheet, with each tab being a different year. And what you want to do through this consolidating data tab is put everything into one big summary file. And that's just an extension of what we did earlier with appending and consolidating the data. Okay, now we're going to go over the things that I'm just going to briefly mention, as well as the data object model. Here's two different YouTube videos on that. You might have seen this come up when you're doing Excel on your own, or even when we're just doing things. You'll see, add this data to the data model. And that comes under Get and Transform. It also shows up under pivot tables, add this data to the data model. And what you're talking about here is that you can combine information. They call it data model, but I look at it as how do you put multiple spreadsheets together, and so you make a comparison. So for the Boilermaker, Boilermaker 2 might be information that we got from the net as weather for that day. So I can actually correlate from a completely different source what's the temperature versus what was the finishing times. Is there a good solid correlation of that? And once you develop a relationship, which you'll be seeing in a moment, in the following slide, is you can take any one of these and basically drop into a pivot table, similar to what you did with a similar pivot table that we showed earlier. What you have to do is set up a relationship. And create relationship, think of this like a VLOOKUP. And VLOOKUP says this column is related to that entry, and therefore combine it. But you have to do that for every single column. What's nice about this create relationship, once you've defined it once, date here in this table to date in the calendar table, you can just you could actually take any of these, mixing with any of these, and it really helps you to slice and dice your data much more effectively. Here's the first time I used this. We used to have a database which had all these part numbers and then had descriptions. But what the difficulty was, as you went over time, that description changed. And so I got a pretty ugly pivot table. Here I have what the item number is, but then there's three different ways to describe it. So it's ugly because each one of those counted as one. And what I really want is to have a single table which has just a single number. Compared it to my original table, I combine those together and I have a single part number with a single description. Much, much better. It shows three. Before we're showing three different instances of count one. Power Pivot. It's Office add-in. It's pivot tables on steroids. There's a good 6-minute introduction. Actually, it's a 3-minute and 32-minute second introduction of the top 5 features. And it's from a book called Power Pivot for the Data Analyst. It's a bit dated because it's based on Excel 2010. But what you can do is look at all the advantages, which takes the data model and really stretches it so you could make it even more powerful. So this is what can hold up to 122 million records. This is within an Excel spreadsheet. And one of the key points here, we see our friend, which we talked about, key point 1, pivot table up at the top here. And so that the summarized version of that won't be 122 million rows. Hopefully it'll be less than a million. Let's look at Power BI, which is a summary, a dashboard. This is a dashboard. Now there's two different things I'd like to actually focus in on. One is this maps, not only with maps, but it actually does a breakout according to a pie chart. Larger the pie chart, the greater the value of the data. It also shows how it's divided. But what's particularly interesting is this, where you have a drawing, it might be your building, and based on the values of an Excel table that can change over time, these colors change. And the person who came up with this idea had best new application, I think in 2016. Might be in 2017. Let's do a quick summary. Best format for data collection allows pivot table analysis. All the possible entries for region are in the same column. All the week endings are in the same column. Single value for each combination. Raw data over 1 million is summarized. Could fit in Microsoft Excel's 1 million row limit. I had something where I had 2 million. That's when I put it together in the pivot table, came out to maybe 200 rows. We then taught you two new things under Get and Transform, or at least introduce you to them. Transform into best data format. That's called unpivoting. And consolidate or append file folders, workbooks, tabs into one summary sheet, so that the structure of how the information is put in does not hurt your analysis where you have to go month to month. It's all in one place. And data model, multiple tables for pivot tables. You saw that you could have two different things, which calendar we showed, and also Boilermaker. And this allows you use more than one table. It can be 10, 15 tables, as long as there's a relationship that you make. Questions? And as Norval said, I live in the hamlet of Graysville. And so my email is graysville@gmail.com. And sometimes it's just a quick question. Feel free to send an email for it. My great idea, which is not just in time, almost in time, was I should have a web page which shows the dynamic resource list of different ways you can learn each one of these, both free and paid. And so that will probably be up within a week. But does anybody have any questions?
Okay, Greg, I can see some of the questions here. How about if I just go through them one by one and let you take each one? Okay. First one we've got is, if I am importing data from several databases, how does the pivot table handle information that has a different format?
In a way, that's two questions. One is, you might have the same information, but over time, that in 2008, for example, on the Boilermaker, it had a different column structure than it was in 2009 on. And so you'd have to, there are some tricks where you're able to combine those. But what you are trying to do is, when you have, if it's in different databases, try to come up with the version of VLOOKUP that's in Power Excel, or Power Query, or Get and Transform, and merge it into one larger table that way. The second way of doing that would be put it into Power Pivot, or the data model, and using the relationship between the first table and the second table, the second and the third table, so they're all related. And you can use the pivot table format with the multiple tables, and you drag and drop that way so you can isolate the information that you want. It might not be all completely compatible because it might compatible. They might be at different levels of entry of different levels of granularity, but it does allow that to put different information together. Okay, the second question.
Okay, we're going to move on here. Now, this is in reference to taking information out of Facebook. Does it work for other social media or just Facebook?
Right now, it's directly for Facebook as a drop-down menu. I don't think it is on other media, but if you convert the other media to Excel files, it's the same concept as you want to develop a metric on how effective your social media exposure is.
Okay. Moving on, the next question, is it possible to connect a pivot table to an external database so that the pivot table automatically updates as the information within that database changes?
Okay, the answer is a very definitive no and yes. What happens is when you draw information from a different external data table, you will refresh basically the information that goes that the pivot table uses to analyze the information. But the pivot table puts in something called a cache, and you actually have to refresh the pivot table, which is not that hard. You saw me hit that word refresh earlier. That refreshes from the base, so any changes that you have in the external data source can be shown as far as being in the pivot table itself. But the main thing is it's not automatic, and that's one of the criticisms. It should be automatic, but right now it is not. But it's still easy.
Okay, looks like we still have about 5 minutes left. If anyone has any additional questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat box. While we're waiting for you to do that, we'll go ahead and remind everyone that our next webinar is Tuesday, May the 8th. It'll be 12 noon Eastern Time. It'll be application of SOFARE and quality tools for continuous improvement projects with Marlon Garcia-Swider of the FDA. Okay, and as a statement, it sounds like a pivot table can be used for real-time inventory data.
Once that you hit refresh, it can be, and that's, as I said, refresh is going to be a new best friend, just because you can now do things that you could not do. It automates the task of taking information from a master database and putting it into analysis. You just have to hit refresh. And that's pretty real time.
One participant is making a comment. Although I have Office 2016, Excel does not show Power Pivot.
Okay, let's see. I'll show you where you. Now that's because Excel. Oops. If you go to File here, and you go to, is it Options? And you go to Add-ins. I actually had to download the Power Pivot for Excel onto my computer. And this is a problem. This is where it's a major advance to have Power Query integrated in. There's some companies you don't have administrator rights, so you can download it for free, but you can't put it on without IT's use. So basically here, what you can see is I have Power Map, Power Pivot, Power View, and these are, you actually go to Power Pivot download, and you can download it, and hopefully you can put it on your own computer. But that's the difference between an add-in and what we see up here, which is data, where this is now integrated into Excel. How to import data from stacks. There used to be a great website in which that would simply to be use get data from web, but I think Microsoft actually changed it so it's not as valuable. But basically what you would do is you go to from web, basic URL, and then wherever you had the place that has the numbers, see if you can't put the URL in, and it can be interpreted. But the web, what's really good is they've really increased the ability to take information from the web and bring it into Excel.
Okay, let's see here. We're looking to see if we have any further questions. I'm not seeing any. One last note, too, before I forget. I did notice that a few people signed in with just their first name, and some folks, we have some that have very common first names where we might have, for example, 2 Dans or 6 Lisas on the line at the same time. We need to ask folks to please include their last names when they are showing up in the list on the participants list, so that way we know who gets the cert afterwards. So anyway, that just kind of helps us make sure that you do receive a cert for attending today. Greg, I'm not seeing any further questions coming across.
Just a quick summary is we introduce you to certain key terms: Power Query, Get in, Transform, Data Model. Now that you've at least been introduced to these terms, Google it, use YouTube, and then there's, if you want to go past that, there are paid courses out there as well. But you can see some of the things we did was not that complicated, so I hope the information wasn't overwhelming, because it was a fair amount of information.
And we thank you, Greg, for presenting that for us today. We'd like to thank everybody also for participating as well. We look forward to seeing everybody hopefully next Tuesday, 12 noon Eastern Time, for our next webinar. Until then, we'd like to say thanks again, and we'll see you soon. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Bye now.